Hello YouTube, welcome back to the Card Combo Show episode 95. We are getting close to that big round 100. And this week I will be looking at Terra from Opus 15, Previa from Opus 12, Atomos from Opus 16, and Exdeath from Opus 17. Right, first up we have Terra. So she is a 4CP 8k ice forward with the text, when Terra enters the field, you may reveal any number of summons from your hand. When you do so, choose up to the same number of characters as summons you revealed, dull them and freeze them. And when you cast a summon, choose up to one forward and up to one backup, dull or freeze the former and dull or freeze the latter. So quite powerful summon effect, and also just nice to be able to lock down lots of your opponent's characters if you have a fair few summons in hand as well. Excuse me. Right, so first up, Rydia. Now, if you've seen what my deck profile, my Earth Ice deck profile, which focuses heavily on this Terra and this Rydia, then this will already be old news to you, but I love these two cards together. When Rydia enters the field, you can add 2 counters to her, at which point you can then pay 0 to cast a summon equal to or less than the number of counters on her. And I ran this with lots of 1 cost or 2 cost Shivas, which was quite effective given the fact that I would then be getting a dull or freeze on both a backup and a forward with this Terra. So just being able to cast summons for free and then getting added value with the Terra is just fantastic. And because it was only running low cost summons, it means that you weren't required to then play other 4 characters to then increase Rydia's counters to then get more effect off of it. Basically, it was always going to be just a case of casting lots of summons for cheap or for free, and just dulling and freezing out your opponent's board. Next, we have Zalera the Death Seraph. So break and dull. Break all the dull forwards of cost 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and 13 opponent controls. Now, the reason this works nicely with Terra is because you would cast Zalera, and then Terra's effect would go on the stack. Terra's effect would then get to dull a forward, so you can cast Zalera, which would break a forward which is dull but isn't dull at the moment. Then you can use Terra to dull it, at which point when Zalera resolves, it is then broken. So your opponent would have to respond after Terra's effect is resolved, but before Zalera has resolved, to reactivate that forward, which can be done easily, but it's just a case of they may think, oh, I'm safe from a Zalera. You play Terra, you then cast Zalera, and you get to break the forward. Ixion. So Ixion breaks all 2 cost forwards. If you pay the extra cost, then you get to break all 3 forwards as well. So basically just being able to break maybe a couple of forwards in your opponent's field and then using Terra to also dull something else out of the way is really, really nice. Just being able to basically move most of their board out of the way is quite nice, and being able to also then lock down your opponent's backups as well with Terra, which is a surprising, in some ways it's actually almost better than dulling out or freezing your opponent's forwards, because dulling out and freezing backups with really good activated effects, so like dulling out or freezing the Tyro, for example, to stop that additional 2k buff, or I don't know, Star Sybil, something along those lines, is quite a swing in your favor, to be honest. Scholar. So dull, choose one forward, dull it. You can only use this ability if you've cast a summon this turn. So you can cast a summon with Terra, at which point it doesn't matter what the summon is. You can then, with Terra's effect, choose one forward, freeze it. You can then use this Scholar to just dull, and then you get to dull the forward that you froze as well, meaning that you have now dull and froze a forward for casting this one summon. The summon doesn't even have to be an ice, it can be absolutely anything whatsoever, but just basically consider the fact that by having Terra and this Scholar on the field, you increase the cost of the summon by 1 CP, 1 ice CP, but now you've got to dull and freeze a forward at the same time, which isn't too bad. Man in Black, so this ties in nicely with things like Ixion. Sorry, I couldn't remember that for a minute. So yeah, it works nicely with a lot of these cards, to be honest. But yeah, Zalera as well, Ixion, but basically being able to make it so that you can dull a forward out with Terra, you can make a forward not attack or block with Man in Black, and then you've also got the summons effect as well. But being able to use Man in Black to constantly recur the summons from your break zone and then keep on casting them, and again, if you're running something like I did with a high Shiva count, high low costed Shiva count, so constantly playing either 1 or 2 CP, but you get to keep on replaying that Man in Black, is really, really good, especially if you're running something like the Shivas, which counts how many Shivas are in the break zone. If you've just got that one Shiva that's out of the break zone, removed from game, constantly being recast from Man in Black, you can keep on absolutely nuking stuff and dulling freezing stuff with Terra, making stuff not attack or block. It's just a really fun little combo. Levnato, so 2 cards that want you to have lots of summons in hand, so you would probably run them in a summon heavy deck anyway. So, Leonardo enters the field, you may reveal any number of summons from your hand. When you reveal no summons, put Leonardo into the break zone. When you reveal 2 or more summons, choose one dull forward, break it. So the forward is required to be dull, which means you will have actually, cast a summon or something, whatever, dull it out of the way first. But then you can use Leonardo, and again in a summon heavy deck, reveal 2, break something, which for 3 CP isn't too bad. Hades. I can't believe I'm talking about Opus on Hades. I actually quite like this card. So choose one forward and one backup your opponent controls. Dull the forward and return the backup to its owner's hand. Your opponent discards 1 card from his or her hand. This is actually quite nice if your opponent has no cards in hand, because the backup that gets returned to their hand is then what has to be discarded. So yeah, that's quite nice. The reason that works this way is because the first effect is choose one forward and backup, dull the forward, return the backup. That's all one sentence, and then the last sentence is your opponent discards 1 card from their hand, which means that is the last kind of point of operation within the summon. So first thing is you choose the forward and the backup. The second thing is you dull the forward and return the backup, and then the third thing, and it happens kind of in that order. So yeah, you get to make your opponent dull the backup, discard that backup, sorry. And this is quite funny with Terra, because with Hades, you could choose one forward, it becomes dull. With Terra, it then becomes frozen as well. And then you can freeze out another backup your opponent controls with Terra. And then with Hades, you are bouncing a backup back to the hand. So they've just lost 1 forward, which is now dull and frozen, and you've frozen 1 backup, and you've returned another backup to their hand. Even at 5 backups, they now only have 3 backups they can actually use in their turn the following turn. And not to mention the fact that you've also made them discard as well. So not too shabby. Right, next up we have Previa. So he's a 4 CP 6k lightning forward, so quite a bit under power. When a party you control attacks, choose 1 active forward your opponent controls, deal it 8,000 damage, and then when Previa enters the field, choose 1 lightning forward of cost 1 in your break zone, play it onto the field. So a little bit of recursion as well, and some nice party attacking effects as well. Bards. So yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time this has been suggested, but Bards allows all your 1 costs to gain haste, and not to mention when he party attacks or something as well, you then get to search a 1 cost and play it onto the field. So Previa can come onto the field, get a 1 cost lightning from the break zone onto the field, that then will gain haste with Bards, and similarly you could just attack with Bards or something to then get a 1 cost onto the field. When that dies, then use Previa. But also, it's just a case of lots of party attacks, right? So Bards with party attacking to search 1 cost, you then get to deal 8k to an active forward, quite nice. What you could do is, let's say you've already got Bards on the field, you play Previa to play a random lightning 1 cost from the break zone onto the field. That now has haste with Bards, so Bards and that forward could party attack together if you have some means of making it so multi-elements can attack together, which you could use with the Chocobo backup. They would party attack, you then get to search yourself a 1 cost, which would be shock horror, Previa. You'd also get to deal 8k to an active forward. Previa comes onto the field. He then gives Previa haste, and Sid already has haste through Bards, provided he survives the attack. And then Previa and Previa can then party attack as well, then dealing another 8k to an active forward in your opponent's field. Ovyang and Nedging. I think I said that right. But yeah, so they have interesting S abilities, super fragile, really easy to break, but given the fact that you can have 3 of each of them as backups and then 2 additional, or 3 of this card basically, you have a total chance of maybe casting their S abilities 8 times, which is quite fun. And the thing here is that they're quite fragile, so being able to use Previa just to keep on bringing them back onto the field, and with that party attack effect, because these things are likely not going to be attacking on their own unless you are able to get rid of your opponent's board. Being able to make it so that Ovyang can party attack with something else and then deal 8k to an active forward that would block them is quite nice. But also just choose 1 character, lose all its abilities in the turn is quite nice, because then if your opponent's got something like Oran, for example, which would take Previa's ability, or sorry, be a lightning rod for Previa's ability, then means that you can just use Dispel on Oran and then party attack with Mid and something else maybe, and then you can kill something else with 8k. Ewan, when Ewan enters the field, choose 1 damage forward, break it. Really effective card, and it will always be doing more than what your opponent has paid to kill him. And even if he just breaks a forward upon entry and then you get to block with him, that's still pretty decent. If this card read as its current text and then put it into the break zone, the next damage you would take is 0. Not too bad. But again, super easy to kill anyway, so that's why you run Previa with it, to constantly keep on recurring it. And Lightning has a few ways of dealing a little bit of chip damage, but to be honest, it pairs pairs better with fire or wind. Just being able to dull one back up to then deal a K to something, play E1 onto the field, break it, or play mid Previa to then play E1 onto the field to break it. And again, works nicely in wind because it also works nicely with that original Bart's. Exdeath. Yeah, so Exdeath to break one of your opponent's forwards, to then bring in mid Previa, to then bring in something else. Just recur your field whilst also attacking their field at the same time. Noctis, again, isn't anything new, but still decent and worth talking about. So mid Previa and the Bart's that I spoke about earlier, those two cards together, alongside this Noctis, pretty broken. Because if you get like Bart's Boko, mid Previa, and something else onto the field, you can be dealing 8k to an active forward, then Noctis is effective, dull and freezing a forward, or just choosing any forward and dealing at 8k, monster break it, giving Noctis haste potentially, or just drawing a card. It's really good. And the fact that you can keep on searching all these cards as well, searching all these one cost with Bart's as well, is really cool. So yeah, just lots of easy ways to be able to just annihilate your opponent's board. Sid Haze, bit weird, I agree, but when he enters the field, when he enters the field or attacks, activate all the job engineer you control. Mid Previa is an engineer, so part of the slight engineer engine we have, engineer engine, and then you can dull, choose one forward other than Sid Haze, against plus 1,000 for each job engineer you control until the end of the turn. Given the fact that mid Previa is quite small, he'll probably die quite quickly, but I think there is a mid Previa backup, so you might want to be running that instead of this forward. But again, this forward has some nice attack ability or party attack effects, and again, Sid Haze is wind, so you know there's a bit of a theme here. Right, Tidus from... Did I say this in the beginning? I don't think I said this in the beginning. Why didn't it show up? Anyway, Tidus. A 4 CP 8k water forward. The category 10 forwards other than Tidus you control gain plus 1,000 power. When Tidus enters the field, you may return one backup you control to its owner's hand. When you do so, choose one forward. Return it to its owner's hand, and then quick hit with just an S. Activate Tidus. Tidus gains plus 2,000 power to the end of the turn. Yes, I know it's technically Tidus, but I'm calling it Tidus anyway because I'm lazy. Leviathan, Lord of the Hall. So if you've already got Leviathan on the field, you can play Tidus to then bounce it back up. That triggers Leviathan, do minus 9k, and then Tidus gets to bounce it forward. It can actually be your own forward because it just says choose one forward, return to his owner's hand. So you could return Tidus back to your own hand if you want, at which point that will trigger Leviathan again. So yeah, just let me... It's been so long since I read Leviathan's text anyway. When a character is returned from the field to its owner's hand. Yeah, so it's not required to be your opponent's stuff. So yeah, just being able to bounce two things, potentially both back to your hand, to do minus 9k to something, not too shabby. Given the fact that you've already played Leviathan, and getting him back to your hand to then replay isn't exactly great. There's lots of easy ways to be able to bounce in water, but playing Tidus, just to get a backup back to hand, potentially two cards back to hand. So if you imagine you bounce Tidus back to your own hand as well as a backup, you have paid full CP, but then you got full CP back, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Kimari makes a lot of sense, this one. So you play Tidus to bounce Kimari back to your hand. You then get to replay him, give a counter to something else, probably Tidus. So let's say you played Tidus early game. Let's say you played Kimari early game and you've given Auron the counter for Kimari. You then play Tidus to bounce Kimari back to hand, replay Kimari to then give Tidus the effect as well. And now Kimari is protecting both Auron and Tidus. And not to mention the fact you're getting to bounce one of your opponent's forwards as well. Andoria. So when Andoria enters the field, choose one forward. If you control two or more forwards, put it at the bottom of his owner's deck. So being able to replay Andoria, because it is a very strong effect, is quite nice. Obviously it has to already have been on the field, which means you already have to have had two forwards at some point, but you know, they die eventually. You play Tidus, which means you've got hopefully at least one other forward to bounce Andoria back to hand, then bounce one of your opponent's forwards. So it might be a case of they've got two really troublesome forwards, bounce one back to the hand, you then play Andoria again to then put the other forwards at the bottom of their deck. And putting something at the bottom of your opponent's deck in some ways is almost better than removing from game, because it screws with their deck a little bit, but also it's just really awkward to get to unless they have some sort of search mechanic. Shantoto. So if your opponent has one card or less in their hand, the cost required to cast Shantoto is reduced by 3. So 1 CP, which can also grab you a character other than Shantoto from your break zone, adding hand is quite nice. If your opponent is consistently on quite few cards, being able to use Tidus to rebounce your Shantoto back to hand, because remember, you can bounce a backup and then choose your own forwards and bounce them back to constantly keep on replaying Shantoto to keep on getting those forwards back from your break zone. Ain't too bad. However, the real play here is to bounce Knight back to your hand, and then you bounce Shantoto back to your hand. You then play Knight onto the field to gain yourself a crystal, and then you discard, or sorry, you remove Shantoto from the game, pay a crystal and 2 CP to then dull all your opponent's forwards for a final push for game, which is something that generally, because replaying your or getting your crystals back onto the field can be kind of awkward sometimes, especially when you've run out. Realm is probably the best way of doing it. So you play Realm onto the field, choose a forward or a monster you control, bounce it back to your hand, you gain a crystal. She can bounce herself, which is quite nice. But still, being able to play Tidus to put Shantoto back in your hand is quite nice, because your opponent sees that Shantoto on the field and they might still be wary of it, but they'll be aware of the fact that that Shantoto on the field means that you've got one less chance of actually casting that. So then be able to play Tidus to bounce Shantoto back to your hand to then play the Knight, gain the crystal, then use Shantoto's effect to push for game. It's quite saucy. Walker. So yeah, he gains a counter for every 10 character that enter 10 forward, sorry. He gains a counter for that, and then you can use 3 counters to be able to pay for his S ability, which is incredibly strong. And being able to use Tidus to bounce again a backup back to hand to then choose your own forwards to bounce them back to hand is quite nice. You can combine that with something like Yuna, so you could let's say play Tidus onto the field. That will give Walker his second counter, provided you've just played Walker, you know, the previous turn or something. You could then bounce it back up and then bounce, let's say, Yuna back to your hand. You can then replay Yuna. That will also give Walker another counter. But let's say the backup you bounce is Kimari. You could pay 2, using Kimari as the payment cost, obviously, to play Tidus, bounce Yuna back to your hand. You then discard Kimari and something else to play Yuna onto the field, to then bring Kimari back onto the field to give something else another counter with Kimari, as well as triggering Walker's effect to gain another counter as well. So yeah, this Tidus isn't played very often in the Guardians deck, mostly just due to the fact that the newer light Tidus can become free and has a really nice attack ability. But actually this Tidus buffing everything by 1 just as standard I think is quite good. And again, being able to bounce your own forwards or backups to be able to regain their effects as well, I think is quite fun as well. And Blue Worm, so I mentioned earlier Realm, she was the card that traditionally got played with this card, because when Blue Worm enters the field you get to draw a card, but then pay 0 until the end of the turn. Blue Worm also becomes a forward 6k power, but at the end of the turn, break Blue Worm. So you make it a forward and you attack with it, it will then die the following turn. So you could, let's say you make it a forward, you attack with it, and then you play Tidus onto the field to bounce it back to your hand. Again, you will have to bounce it back up to then bounce Blue Worm, but if you're mono water, you could then discard that back up to then replay Blue Worm to then get another card, or if you've just got the 2 CP open to replay it, might as well. Right, next up we have Atomos, a 2 CP 7 wind monster. I don't think anyone doesn't know what this card does, but I'll read it out anyway. During each turn, when you cast the second card you've cast, choose up to 2 backups, activate them, and then damage 3, pay 0 until the end of the turn. It becomes a 7k forward, and when Atomos attacks, activate all the backups you control. You can use this ability doing once and during your turn. No, only once per turn. Jesus Christ, I'll get there eventually. So yeah, this card is just insanely powerful. You basically get 2 backups back when you cast the second card. Bear in mind that this is cast the second card, not played the second card. So let's say you cast something that plays something onto the field, you won't get the 2 backups back because that is played onto the field, not cast. Remember, cast is also playing, but playing is not cast. Yeah. Right, so, I mean, there's not going to be anything new here, really, because even the really kind of weird stuff is still pretty meta. So, Talika, to reduce the cost of everything by 1, to then keep on playing things for 1 CP cheaper. You want to be playing at least a couple of things with Talika, otherwise you might as well have just told Talika for the effect. But at which point that then reactivates Atomos. This works particularly well with the Shikari engine. It was played quite heavily, like, a few sets ago. Isn't really played that much anymore, but it is still quite fun to play because Shikaris also have reactivation and card draws and things like that. But either way, being able to make things a little bit cheaper and then also reactivating stuff with Atomos means you get even more cost efficiency. Ochu. So you play Ochu onto the field, choose up to 2 backups, activate them. So let's say you play a 2 cost, let's say you play Atomos onto the field and then you play Ochu onto the field. You then get 4 backups back. Not bad at all. Really itchy nose, sorry guys, it's winter, I don't even have hay fever, come on. Yeah, so when you cast the third cast, why are these worded so weirdly? When you cast the third card you have cast this turn, activate all the backups you control. So again works nicely with Atomos. You play one card, you then play the second card, get 2 backups back, you then play the third card, get all your backups back, and then if you can push it all the way to 5 cards, you then get to reveal the top card of your deck with Rosa. And if it's character play onto the field, just be mindful of, you know, playing too many of the same cards, because otherwise you'll just keep on missing all the time. And you'll also want to be doing this with lots of cards in hand, or potentially just ways to keep on replaying stuff, so utilizing things like the Chocobo Summon or Althea. Oops. Surprise, spoiled. Yeah, so Realm. You play Realm onto the field to then bring in Atomos and a 1-cost monster, bringing something like Goblin, which then searches you another Goblin is quite nice. So Realm will enter along with Atomos and Goblin. You can then play, well, let's say you search another Goblin with, well, you had to search another Goblin with the Goblin. Oh my god, I'm saying the word Goblin so many times. You search another Goblin, and you play that onto the field, at which point you can, if you're replaying this same Goblin, you then get to search another Goblin and reactivate 2 backups. God. And then you could play that Goblin to then search another Goblin. And yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this word so many times, but it's a nice way to be able to get to Realm's effect of being able to bounce something if you control 5 or more monsters to bounce. But also just an easy way to recover Realm's cost as well, by playing 2 things onto the field, one of which is going to constantly be just recurring stuff. You don't have to be in Wind for this, but just playing Realm to search Atomos in a monster deck I ran quite a few, a couple of opus ago, was really, really nice, because most monsters are pretty cheap or pretty efficient. So being able to then replay stuff and also get your backups back through something like Atomos is a lot of fun. Fiona, yeah, just let's say you haven't really done anything with your backups, you attack with Atomos, and then on the stack use Fiona to go search yourself any one character, and then reactivate your backups again, and then potentially on your opponent's turn, just do the same thing. Yeah, constant backup reactivation using something like Fiona is really, really good. And you know, you don't even have to attack with Atomos, just cast the second card you cast and reactivate. Say you're going to reactivate Fiona, you then pay for her effect to search yourself something. Chocolate, again, this, like I said, there is nothing new here, but whenever you need to reactivate something but you haven't actually used those backups, you might as well have something like Chocolate where you just dull to gain herself a counter or just draw you a free card. Adelaide, this is where things get a little bit spicier. So being able to do some form of reactivation with your backups is really nice when you are actually using that CP. So as I mentioned with Chocolate, if you're not going to use it, then you might as well just, you know, dull her to gain yourself a counter. But if you're in Wind Fire and you want to use those 2 CP for something, Adelaide, just pay for Adelaide's effect, and now everything is doing, or all ability damage is now being doubled, which is really cool, which you can then utilize to double again and again and again. So just constant backup reactivation whilst paying for Adelaide's effect, meaning it's basically becoming free, is really, really fun. And then you combine it with something like Mutsuki, which is a card I personally quite like, means that you can keep on reactivating with Atomos, but also reactivating with Mutsuki, because she activates excuse me, with when any of your opponent's forwards die, she gets to reactivate as well. So you've got a couple of means of reactivation in Wind Fire, but what's more fun is to, I think my mouth just goes quicker than my brain, right? And my brain's pretty slow. So what's even more fun is to pay for Adelaide's effect 3 times, so a total of 6 CP, and then you keep on dulling Mutsuki to just deal 8k to things. 8k once, 8k twice, 8k 3 times, and every time she's killing something, she gets to reactivate. Basically the same as a board wipe, I appreciate that, and if your opponent has forwards which can't be targeted, then not great. But still a lot of fun and kind of weird, and a nice way to utilize Mutsuki's effect of things breaking and reactivating her. But really, Dancers is where it's at. So yeah, let's say you pay for Adelaide's effect, use Atomos to reactivate it, to then pay for it again. Just make sure that this Dancer is dull at the end of the turn, and you get to deal 2,000 damage, which is actually then buffed to 4,000 or 8,000 or 16,000. Yeah, pretty nasty. And it works nicely, Atomos works nicely with Fire Wind Dancers as well, because you get to reactivate those backups. Again, if you've used Adelaide's effect, maybe you've only paid the once, you've got a couple of backups, the Dancer backups or Pinello or something like that, which is now dealing 2k or 4k to the entire of your opponent's board, and you're dealing 2 of those to maybe get a little bit of board wipe, or just 2k, 2k, reactivate 2k, 2k, and yeah, just a lot of fun and weird things you can do with that. Alright, lastly we have Exdeath, the Wizard. I always wish his job was as like Lord of the Void or something like that. Wizard seems so underwhelming. Anyway, he's a 4CP 8k lightning forward. If there are 10 or more cards removed from the game, Exdeath gains plus 2000 power, and when Exdeath enters the field, remove all the characters in each player's break zone from the game. At the end of each of your turns, if there are 20 or more cards removed from the game, your opponent selects one character they control, remove it from the game. So yeah, pretty effective. It's not the sort of card you play too early, and you don't necessarily build, you might build a deck around him. I think it's more just you have some cards kind of built in the deck with him in consideration. He isn't like the main focus of the deck. He's just a really nice card to have late game, remove all those cards, and now he's going to start being a problem, which requires your opponent to answer him. So Nyx, obviously Kingsglaive actually likes to have a lot of things in the break zone. However, this Nyx allows you to remove one Kingsglaive in the break zone from the game until the turn Nyx gains plus 1000 power, first strike, and cannot be chosen by your opponent's abilities. And that's the sort of effect which you're going to use a couple of times because your opponent might target Nyx with an effect. You then remove something from the break zone. They will then respond by targeting him again with something else. You then remove another thing from the break zone. But you know, it kind of sucks when you're having to do that sort of effect. However, if you are able to then, you know, pay into Exdeath's ability as well using Nyx, it means that you're just a little bit closer to annihilating your opponent's board. Lady Lilith, so you get to remove your own forwards to gain crystals, and then you can use those crystals to either choose a lightning forward and give it haste, or pay 2 crystals to choose from forward or 5 or less, break it. So if you are using Lady Lilith's effect, this is kind of a weird thing to say, but using Lady Lilith's cost restriction on the pay 2 crystal effect, choosing 4 to 5 or less, break it, isn't too bad actually, because that means you are forced to choose the smaller forwards, which actually might be the less annoying forwards. You break that forward, and then your opponent is forced to probably sack off the other bigger forward, which will have cost them more, and it will be removed from game using Exdeath as well. But either way, just being able to remove your own forwards to then again pay into Exdeath's ability. Zidane, when he attacks or enters the field, you get to remove something from your opponent's deck from the game. Even if, I mean, if you replay that, then obviously it comes back into the game and it will go into the break zone. But if you're not planning on playing those cards, just taking them from your opponent's deck, remove from game, they pay into Exdeath's ability. Seymour, so Exdeath will remove all characters from both people's break zones, but not the summons. So that means Seymour is still safe to be played, and you can play him onto the field. If you've got 3 summons in the break zone, you get to choose a forward and break it. However, you can still use Seymour to remove 6 summons from the break zone, again, using Exdeath, or helping Exdeath, sorry, and then you get to deal your opponent a point of damage, which is pretty nice as well. Zemus, so you can remove the top 7 cards from your deck from the game to deal something 7k, or you can remove the top 15 cards from your deck from the game, choose one forward, remove it from the game. You can only use ability once per turn. Yeah, so use this remove 15 once, you've now removed 16 cards from the game. I mean, you only had to have had 4 removed previously, or just 4 in the break zone with played with Exdeath, and then you are good to go with Exdeath. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, removing 15 cards from your own deck is pretty sketchy, and it's something you kind of want to do earlier on, because if you're doing it late game and you now don't have, like, you got like, I don't know, 3 or 4 cards left in your deck, that's not great. And Exdeath is a card that likes to be played a bit later on, but utilizing something like Zemus means that actually maybe you can play Exdeath a little bit earlier before your opponent has had a chance to properly set up, and Exdeath is going to start removing stuff pretty fast. Cloud, pay 3, remove the top 7 cards of your deck from the game, choose one forward, break it. You can only use ability during a main phase and only once per turn. This card is really, really good. It searches you something, which is pretty nice on a forward, to be honest. And it's also 7 character, so there's loads of good 7 characters out there. But yeah, paying the 3 to remove 7 to break something, which then funds Exdeath. Play Exdeath, you then hopefully will get to remove something else. And finally, you know, whenever something's put from the field to the break zone, you get to remove it instead, and then again, Exdeath. There we go, folks. All done and dusted. Yeah, Opus 18 is slowly creeping over the hill. It got delayed, as it kind of does frequently, but that's just the nature of the games. A lot of people complain about this sort of thing, but having worked in distribution myself in the past, I kind of understand how these things can happen. Just be patient. It gives us more time to play with these sorts of cards, find out new weird things that are happening, and it kind of extends the spoiler period a little bit as well, which is also quite nice. But yeah, either way, we now have the Arden set as well, which I will do a review of shortly, and there are some really strong cards in there. Well, I say strong cards, strong tribal cards, but strong all the same. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.